went the wrong way. No, I have to go in the front. How many are there?
Should be big.
I don't know. Where would you like us? Maybe okay, well, yes, okay.
To go from the front. Okay. All right.
Right under these lights.
I know.
Hey, which water is, I guess, which is yours, ours, though?
Oh, you did? Okay.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you are here to hear us discuss killer women. If you are, please take a seat if you'd like. We can, you can file in as well while we begin the discussion, but we have a lot of wonderful ground to cover today. I would like to start by saying that this is a Sisters in Crime Connecticut panel. So if you're not familiar with this organization, it is actually the Connecticut chapter of Sisters in Crime National, which is an international organization dedicated to the advancement, recognition, and professional development of women crime writers. It was founded actually in 1986, and since then, national and chapters all across the country have been hosting in-person and virtual events for writers who deal with all subgenres in the crime fiction category. We are all members of Sisters in Crime Connecticut, so if you're interested as a reader to come to some upcoming events, or you're a writer who deals with mysteries or thrillers and would like to join our community, go to SinC-Connecticut, S-I-N-C, Connecticut.com. Okay, so we are here today to talk about killer women and how writing crime fiction from a female point of view influences how we all work as professional crime writers today. I'm going to go down this wonderful panel here today and introduce everyone. Let's see, we will start with Elise Hart Kipness over there at the end. Elise is a national television sports reporter turned thriller writer. In her debut novel, Lights Out, which comes out on November 1st, Elise draws on her personal experience chasing marquee athletes through the tunnels of Madison Square Garden and standing before glaring lights, reporting to national audiences. She is a resident of Stamford and Key West, Florida, and she is currently finishing her second novel in the Kate Green series. And next to her, we have Emily Arsenault. Emily is the author of several literary mysteries, including Broken Tea Glass, a New York Times notable crime book, In Search of the Rose Notes, a Wall Street Journal Best Crime Book of the Year, The Last Thing I Told You, What Strange Creatures, and her young adult suspense novels, which include The Leaf Reader and most recently, When All the Girls Are Sleeping. Emily lives in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts. Then we have Manju Soni. Manju, who writes under the pseudonym MJ Soni, was born in South Africa and lives in Mystic, Connecticut. Her debut nonfiction book, Defying Apartheid, was published by Amazon Kindle Singles in 2016 and captures her experiences as a young activist against apartheid. Her mystery stories have been published in Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine, Akashic Books, and the Best New England Crime Stories anthology. And she's currently working on a psychological suspense novel called The Experiment. Then we have Wendy Walker. Wendy is the international best-selling author of psychological suspense. Her latest novels include Don't Look for Me, What Remains, and American Girl, which just published this last week. Her books have been published in over 23 foreign languages and have been optioned for film and television. Wendy is a graduate of Brown University and Georgetown Law School. And prior to writing, she worked as a lawyer, an investment banker, and trained for competitive figure skating. She lives in Fairfield County, where she raised 3 sons. And last but not least, we have Lynne Constantine. Lynne is the internationally best-selling author who writes with her sister under the pen name Liv Constantine. Their debut thriller, The Last Mrs. Parrish, was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, and their books have sold over 1.5 million copies worldwide. They're available in 34 countries and in development for both television and film. Lynne has a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University. Okay, so yes, applause all around. Yes, I will introduce myself as well. I'm Tessa Wegert. I am the author of the Shayna Merchant series, which is a female-driven, female-led detective series set in the Thousand Islands in upstate New York. The next book in the series, which is the 5th, will be out on December 5th, and it's called Devils at the Door. So we are all here not only as members of Sisters in Crime Connecticut, but also because we all are women crime writers who to some extent, and we're going to delve into that today, really are influenced by the fact that we are writing from a female point of view and through a female lens. So I want to start off by asking whether you all think that there is a different kind of perspective that female crime writers bring to thriller and mystery writing. Obviously, women crime writers are having a big moment right now and have been for a couple of decades, really, at this point. You know, of course, we had years ago, decades ago, a century ago, Agatha Christie, but in more recent times, we've had authors like Gillian Flynn and countless others. I couldn't begin to name them all. Many of these influential women crime writers are here today, and many of them are on this very stage. But how much does the fact that we're female writers covering crime fiction stories really influence the way that we, really our approach to storytelling? Do you think that the way that we as women write crime fiction differs from the way maybe our male counterparts do? So I will start with Lynne, since she's right here. Do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Well, I only know how to write as a woman, since that's what I am. But I do think that in the domestic suspense space, which is what I write, there is a bit of a difference that I see. I mean, I think men obviously can do it well, but it's been more women in this genre. And it's interesting, I just saw Meryl Streep actually talking about women thinking like men, and that women have sort of learned the language of men and internalized that. And she was saying, you have to actually dream about something before you can live it. And she said, and women do that. But men don't know how to talk like women. So I don't know, you know, I think that there is a bit of a difference. These stories are more close. You know, we're not talking about thrillers that are wider, but when you're talking about the domestic space, and a lot of times marriage thrillers and family, I think the women bring a different perspective to it as mothers, as wives, and not that a man can't embody that, but I think it may be a little bit more challenging because they're not experiencing the same things that we are.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think there are a few ways that it's impacted the whole genre. I think the first is when women really started diving in and writing outside of the boundaries of legal thriller, conspiracy thriller, or sort of an Agatha Christie whodunit. We started getting the psychological thrillers, the domestic thrillers, and so in that way, by women writing in the genre and sort of being given license maybe to write a thriller in a different way, it's exploded the genre. And now we are seeing men, you know, also writing in those corridors that have been opened up. And second, yes, I think we bring a different perspective in all the things that Lynne said, but I will also add that there are many crimes where women are predominantly the victims of those crimes. Domestic abuse, sexual assault, not the only victims, but just statistically tend to be the victims of those crimes. And so as women growing up, you know, just walking through our lives, we've always been acutely aware of those dangers. And so I think when we write about crime, we are bringing decades of sort of just a lingering fear and an awareness that we are possible victims of those crimes. And I think it adds a little bit more nuance when we are writing about the families of the victims and the victims themselves. Sometimes we're seeing now the victims having an entire point of view in these stories. And lastly, I think the explosion of female criminals. So women imagining being murderers, being the evil forces in the book. I think we're seeing a lot more of that.
Manju, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. And I think women are able to, in some ways, dig deeper into the emotional aspects of a story, which I feel a lot of male authors kind of steer away from. But that brings a lot more depth to the story and a different perspective. An example is the story I'm working on has a very patriarchal father-in-law. And I think a woman's relationship with her father-in-law is very different to a man's relationship with his father-in-law. And that kind of invariably plays into the story. So it's just our experiences are different, and our ability to dig deep into the emotional aspects is definitely there.
Emily?
I agree with everything everyone has said here, but I think I'll offer just a little bit of a counterpoint in that I like to read really deeply, very darkly psychological fiction, kind of the darker, the better. And I like to think that when things are really that visceral, gender can sometimes fall away. I was thinking about, very recently I read the book, The Push by, I think it's Audreyne. Yes, and it's about generational trauma and what happens if you believe your child could do something really, really violent. And I thought she did an excellent job. And then I thought back to this book, Defending Jacob by William Landay, that really touched on very similar themes about a son, but from a father's perspective. And I do feel like when something is that scary, there is kind of a human level on which we can all relate, and I can sometimes forget the gender of the author. So that's...
I think it really depends on the type of writer you are. Like for me, I need to have experienced in some way what I'm writing about. And so I couldn't I think in a first person, really get into a guy's brain with the nuances I can into a woman's. And so for me, I kind of, agree with what Wendy and Lynne and Manju were saying about about women adding that extra perspective on the domestic element and having a different type of voice. But then again, there are male authors who are able to go there in their brains. It's just something personally I'm not able to do.
Several of you touched on this a little bit already, but I would love to hear, if you're willing to share, how any of your personal, more female, let's say, experiences from your own lives have found their way into your novels. So we've talked a little bit about the father-daughter relationship. I think Lynne mentioned something too about or sometimes it can be something along the lines of sisterhood, or maybe the motherhood experience of bonding with a child, or even pregnancy. These are all themes that really find their way into many, many novels. So as female crime fiction authors, have any of your personal experiences along those lines perhaps made their way into any of your books or short stories?
I guess I'll start. I think there's always part of you in your books, right? There's some level, whether it's an exact type of trauma. We've all had experiences. In terms of specifics, one thing I did experience was infertility. It took me 5 years before, I had my children, and so I've written some short stories about that. I've had characters who are dealing, with trying to get pregnant, or with, with all of the motherhood and those things. So I would definitely say that has influenced aspects, not necessarily a complete storyline, but a character development piece.
Yes, I will. I could probably just leave it there. Yeah, all of my books have pieces of me in them, and I haven't experienced the exact things that my characters have, but I definitely draw from my own experiences with we all have trauma in our lives to different degrees. Nobody gets through childhood completely unscathed. And I definitely draw from them in every single book. And I think that, the other thing for me is when I am looking for a story idea, they usually come from, things that I've either noticed out in the world and my reaction to things in the world, and things that I read and in the news. And so, when that is how you're getting your story ideas, that's a very personal thing. Not everyone is going to notice, a couple at a cocktail party and think, wow, why am I noticing them? And have that become a story, or have a reaction, at a gas station in upstate Connecticut on, Route 7 and come up with a story. So I think that plays into it as well. So definitely in the characters and the themes and the development of the story, but also in just choosing what story idea, right? We all walk through life looking for these ideas, and different things resonate with us based on our own personal history.
Manju?
I've always been interested in the balance in relationships, and I think every relationship, every interaction, for example, has a balance, and there's often a kind of a skewed balance. And I found this particularly, I used to be an eye surgeon many moons ago, and then I joined the pharmaceutical industry, and I worked in biotech, so yeah, I've been around in other industries for a long time. And in corporate, for example, I think women often are at the lower end of a balance even in a meeting, for example, sometimes. So I like to bring that in and in some way give agency to the person who doesn't have that in my real life, for example, in the corporate world. So, yeah, what was the question again? I'm sorry.
Oh, you definitely answered it.
Okay.
Personal.
Yes. So that is bringing the personal, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Emily?
Sure, I feel like I've brought distinctly female experiences into almost all of my books, but just by way of example of something that was really, well, the theme that really sticks out for me is early motherhood, and how I drew on that for my book, The Evening Spider. When my daughter was first born, I had this really odd experience of I woke up one night and I heard my daughter crying, and I heard over the baby monitor. I didn't have a video monitor. I was too cheap for one of those. I just had the old-fashioned kind, but I heard someone saying shh, shh to her, and I thought, great, my husband is taking care of this. And then I kind of flipped over in the bed, and he was lying there. So it was like, who is there in the room with her? And I raced down the hall, and of course she's just there by herself. But this happened several times, and I live in a very old house, and I just developed this idea that our house must be haunted, or the baby somehow brought the ghost out, and it just to the point where I was sometimes afraid to go to sleep, because I was afraid of waking up to that again, because it was so terrifying. And I love to write about ghostly things. A lot of my books kind of touch on the supernatural, but that wasn't fun at all, and that was just really terrifying. So it took me several years to actually address that in a book, but once I was ready, when my daughter was about 3 years old, I started a book that way with a woman who has that very same experience, and I created a mystery around it. There actually is a mystery in this woman's house. It actually takes place in Connecticut, but it really was a book about the early motherhood experience and the postpartum experience, and how that kind of recalibrates your brain and how unsettling that is, which makes it really good material for a suspense book.
God, Emily, I have chills. I don't know. I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight after hearing that story.
Sorry.
Elise, what do you think?
Well, yes is the answer to your question. I was a female sports reporter, TV sports reporter, in a world that was primarily men. I would go into locker rooms, and I was maybe one of 4 or 5 women with 40 men. The token female at each of the major television networks was on camera. I was one of them. And that's very much part of my book. And even to such an extent with the women issues that I didn't even realize. Like, I was talking to my husband this morning about some of the things that might come up. Literally, my first page starts where my main character is called a bad mom by an NBA player, and her response to that is caught on camera and very visceral. And I think that that was my unconscious wanting to, like, you know, lash out at all the times that I kept my mouth shut and just kind of took all the crap that kind of came my way, because at that point, I just felt lucky to be in the world. You know, this was a while ago. It's not this generation where women, I think, stand up for themselves a lot more. And you just kind of took it because you're like, wow, at least I'm here and I'm grateful. So I do think a lot of my unconscious is getting a lot of stuff out in my writing about that.
Yeah, it sounds like we all use our writing to process past experiences and feelings that we have had. From a craft perspective, I know that we have all written female protagonists as well. Have any of you written a male protagonist or considered, obviously we all have male characters in our stories, and certainly there are many, many male crime writers who have written very compelling, authentic female leads as well. But for all of you, do you gravitate toward a female protagonist? And would you, if you haven't already, consider writing from a male point of view?
Yes. So I also write, as you know, under LC, the initials Shaw, a Jack Logan series. And that book, The Network and the Silent Conspiracy, it started off where Taylor, there are two journalists, and Taylor was my main character, and Jack sort of took over and became the main protagonist. And, you know, he's really one of my favorite characters, and I love him. And he just kind of appeared on the page and seemed to develop that way. And then for the books my sister and I write, they're primarily female protagonists, but we have actually had added male point of view. So in Stranger in the Mirror, you get a male perspective. And also in The Senator's Wife, our recent, you get the perspective of the senator. Now he's not, I wouldn't call him necessarily the main character, but you know, most of our books have multiple characters. We like to alternate. So yeah, that's been interesting. But I mean, it felt pretty natural, and I don't think we had, you know, my only issue with the Jack Logan series, it's a much more traditional thriller. And so I have a nephew who was reading it, and he's like, you really have to punch these fight scenes up. Because my inclination would be like, you know, they'd have like a paragraph, and that's all I would want to do. Is like, no. People want to read more than that, you know. Yeah. The car chase has to be more than one page. And so that was a stretch, but I did it.
I was going to ask if you have written from a male point of view, do you have male beta readers you specifically employ to look at the dialogue and make sure that it sounds like a guy? Wendy?
Yeah, so my first thriller, All Is Not Forgotten, is written entirely in first person, and it's a man writing it and telling the entire story. And I loved writing that book. I think to date, that's probably still my favorite book in terms of writing.
Telling your other books.
What's that?
I'm telling your other children.
I know. Right, it is. It's like picking a favorite child. And I actually wrote a sequel, a short novella for Audible. And when I went to write that, I was like, oh, I love writing Dr. Forrester. I could just write him all the time. He's misogynistic, he's arrogant, he is, but I have great empathy for him, and I try to get that across. And what's interesting, you know, when we're talking about male voices and female voices, when my friends and family read that book, a lot of them couldn't finish because they're like, everything he's saying, you've said, like what, like it's creepy. And not like the misogynistic part, but those were things that I have heard people say or that I have railed against. And so I put them in his, you know, voice, the way he perceives himself and his wife. And he's, but yeah, there was great freedom in writing that character. It had nothing to do with gender. But then I asked myself, well, why did I make him a man? And I did, you know, I look back and I think, okay, well, I did want there to be, you know, a lot of the other characters are women in it, but there was just something that in my mind, I wanted him to be a male voice. And I didn't really have beta readers for it because, you know, the book is, I think it's not designed to, like, it's not like designed to be in a different genre. Like the Elsie Shaw books are conspiracy thrillers, and you pull in, there's a certain expectation about fight scenes and chase scenes and all of that, but this was a psychological thriller through and through, same readership, probably mostly women, and so I just, I just wrote him, and that was that. So.
Sounds like series material to me. Manju?
So yeah, my nonfiction book is, it's about the youth movement against apartheid, and I talk about 3 young men who were very instrumental in getting 1 million students to rise up against apartheid. But I have to be honest, I couldn't write it in first person. I think if I had tried, it would have been, firstly, it's nonfiction, so it's invariably third person. But that kind of distance was easier to work with. I think a first person, I have tried and failed, because I wrote a cold case mystery set in South Africa, and it never saw the light of day because I was told by 2 agents that apartheid does not sell. But that was a first-person male perspective, and I came to an intimate scene, and I had no idea how to write it. And of course, I went to my husband, and I said, so tell me what, I had a whole lot of questions for him, which he just absolutely refused to answer my questions. And so, yeah, and then by the time I finished that book, I realized the female perspective, who was just a side character, was so much more interesting. And so I have failed writing it from a male perspective.
Emily, what are your thoughts? Most of my books are written from a female perspective, but the very first one that I had published was narrated by a male, and that was because it was a mystery that took place at a dictionary company, and my first job out of college was working at a dictionary company, and I decided that I wanted this character to be a person out of college working at a dictionary company who discovers this mystery. And at the time, I found myself very frustrated and embarrassed that I could never write about anything but myself, that this just was a weakness I had as a writer, so I figured I'll just make him a guy, and he won't be me. That'll be just a very strict way to write about someone who is not myself. And I really went all out. Like, I made him like a former football star, and just things that were all completely the opposite of me. And it worked. Like, I was forced to give him his own stuff emotionally to deal with. It was a challenge. Like, I would often be, in the book wondering why I had made that decision, but I was too deep into it by that point. And the way I dealt with the challenges was just to try to be really aggressive about finding lots of different types of beta readers, male and female, and really asking them about those scenes where I really wasn't sure about his emotional reactions to things. Finding other readers besides my husband, because he got tired of trying to be the sole male perspective on this. But ever since then, I never take that decision lightly. I've only had one other book that was narrated half. There were two perspectives. There was a female narrator and a male narrator, and I went back and forth between them. But ever since then, it feels like a very big decision for me to try that again. So.
This is my debut novel, so it's the first one, and it was, first person present. And then for the second book, that's the second in the series, I've tried to challenge myself just by writing some flashbacks in the past tense. So to me, that was, woohoo, trying, to do something different. So maybe in the future, I would try to write a point of view from a man, but there are 2 male characters in my book that I'm kind of obsessed with, and one of them especially that he might be my favorite character, the father, so that's my little angle into that. What about you, Tessa, with yours?
Yes,
Yes, I've never published a book that has been written with a male narrator. I tend to gravitate more toward a female point of view so far, but I've certainly written many short stories from a male point of view. I don't know that I could commit to a full-length novel quite yet. I don't know, it sounds like a good personal challenge though. So to switch gears a little bit here, we are days away from Halloween. We all, at this time of year, are exposed to the endless ads for costumes, and we all see the sexy nurse costume, the sexy Batman costume. Doesn't matter what it is, you can make it sexy somehow, apparently. So let's talk about female stereotypes and tropes in crime fiction. My question for you all, because I think it's fair to say you all to some extent have worked with psychological fiction or psychological suspense. I'm curious to know, do you work hard to avoid some of these stereotypes, like I'm thinking about maybe the femme fatale or the, ice queen executive or the ditzy mistress? Are you conscious of those stereotypes? Do you try intentionally to avoid them? Or do you subvert expectations and use them to your advantage while you're plotting, knowing what your readers are expecting and then kind of turning things on their head?
Yes. Both. I've done both. So in The Last Mrs. Parrish, we have two perspectives, and we have Amber and Daphne, and Amber is very clearly, I don't know if she's necessarily the femme fatale, but she's the conniving homewrecker, and you don't really know why. And so what we did with her is we really wanted to give her a brilliant mind. We wanted her to have, impeccable research, and we wanted her to be able to justify to herself why she was doing what she was doing. So she wasn't just, evil for the sake of being evil. And part of the fun of that book is that you're in her mind and you're hearing her make complete justifications for every horrible thing that she does that make perfect sense to her, and, while sounding very sweet and fooling everyone around her. And then in The Senator's Wife, in that story, we have a woman who needs to bring in a home health care worker, which for a short amount of time, she hopes, for some hip surgery. She's the senator's wife, and they're in D.C., and they're very wealthy. And that home health care worker moves in, and she starts to get sick again. So again, in this book, there are a lot of, and then there's a woman after the senator who's very much, a stereotypical sort of horrible, brazen woman. But again, we hope that we seem
only
to
on
be
the surface.
Yes, only on the surface, and it is fun to play around with that, because we are always thinking, okay, the readers are going to expect this, so we need to do that. But if we do that, they're going to think we're going to do that. I mean, it gets very confusing.
Readers are double reverse psychology.
Right, exactly.
Wendy?
Wow. I think I guess I've done all of those things. I have not purposefully thought at the beginning about tropes and how to use them for my plot to sort of be a twist or mislead or misdirect readers. But the one thing that I keep doing is having these crimes where it's traditionally a female victim, and then switching it up and finding a way to make one of the women in the book the mastermind or the behind all of it, and I don't start out that way, but then I'll be, when you're writing it, sometimes you just be writing and I always write in first person or very close third person, and I really like to be in the head of the character. So sometimes it's the victim or a relative of the victim, and they're just tormented. So I'm tormenting these women, and mostly women characters, and they're just tormented. I'm writing all this torment and angst, and I just get 2/3 of the way through the book, and I'm like, oh my God, I need to switch this up. And then I'll just change the ending or change the plot or do something to make, to add a woman who's not feeling those things, who's having almost a sociopathic kind of response and with no empathy and no emotional reaction, which is very atypical. I mean, just statistically speaking, but it happens to me while I'm writing, because I just feel so immersed in those emotions of these characters, that I feel the need to sort of pull away. So like What Remains, which came out in June, this woman is just, takes place in just a couple of weeks, and she's just in the aftermath of a shooting. She's a cop, and she's tormented by her own mind, but also by the man whose life she saved, who stalks her, and she's just on the run, and she's tormented, and it's like, and so I had to add like a second point of view that was much more detached and away from the main crime scene, and just to give myself some like air. Yeah.
Manju?
Yeah, I'm always very aware of stereotypes, and I think what helped me a lot was reading Stephen King's On Writing, because at the end of that, and I'm sure I'm misquoting the great man, but he kind of says, like, you write out a character, and then turn everything else, like everything about that character differently, and it kind of made me more aware of how to avoid writing very stereotypical kind of characters. So yeah, I try hard, but it's always difficult because women are the weaker, physically weaker sex. So in a thriller, it's like really hard. They have to be more creative, or the author has to be more creative in trying to get them to get the upper hand, because it's not going to be always physical. So.
Yeah, and maybe that's an opportunity, it sounds like, sometimes, right? Yeah, to just keep readers on their toes. Emily? Since my most recent books have been YA, what came to mind with your question for me was the mean girl, this idea of the mean girl. My daughter is 11, and she right now is in the stage of her life where she's just taking on a lot of tween and teen entertainment. And there always seems to be that mean girl that was even there in the 80s, just like who's blonde and rich and makes fun of other girls' outfits. And it always seems to be the same girl. And in fact, my daughter said to me once when she was watching something, like, I don't think there are actually people like that. Like, this is on all the shows. And you kind of want to say, well, wait till you get to high school, you might meet somebody like that. But my most recent YA definitely had a mean girl, and she had some of the stereotypical elements, but I tried to make her a little bit more nuanced. And as actually the mean girl dies, and as somebody is having to investigate her death, a former friend of hers, she has to kind of really look at who this person really was, and also this question of who gives the mean girl her power, and why do we give the mean girl her power, and are all of us maybe deep inside a little bit the mean girl, we're just better at hiding it. And actually the solution to the puzzle of the mean girl's death actually kind of forces you to look at some of those questions. I can't really say exactly how, but yeah, very cool. Elise?
I definitely was aware of stereotypes in writing Lights Out, and Lights Out takes place in Greenwich, Connecticut. My main character is in Greenwich, Connecticut, and also in New York City, where she works. And if everyone here is from Connecticut, you know there are stereotypes there. And I tried very hard to not lean into those stereotypes or to get beneath them in the book, because I think Greenwich, and I don't live in Greenwich, I live next door to Stamford, so, but I really wanted to kind of get into the layers of the town and the women and look at maybe some of the twists of the area and expand on what you might think are the stereotypes of that area. So it was very much in my brain as I was writing that.
Thank you for that. So before we open it up to questions, everyone get your questions ready. If you have questions, I think you can go over, you can actually start if you'd like to make your way over there to prepare to ask your question by the mic. I'd love to just go down the line, starting with Elise, since she's our debut, and have you all talk a little bit about what you have coming up next, as much as you're able to share with the audience today. Elise?
Well, my book, Lights Out, is available right now on Amazon First Reads, and I think there are a couple of books back there. And it's coming out November 1st, so it's after 10 years of working on this and lots of rejections. It's here, and I'm just turned in the developmental edits for book 2, which is called Dangerous Play, and I'm really excited about that one because it goes into kind of the backstory of my main character, who besides being a sports reporter is also a gold medal soccer player. So she's way cooler than me. I'm a soccer mom. She's a gold medal soccer player. So yeah.
Emily?
My next book, I've gone back to adult after doing a couple of YAs. It's called The Lucifer Flower. It's named after one of my favorite flowers, and it's suspense with a tiny bit of supernatural, and there's a lot of 1980s nostalgia in it. Is about all I can say about it.
Love that. Manju?
I have a short story coming out next month in Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine about a young girl who digitizes videos, and she comes across a murder on one of these videos, and it's also, she solves the murder using a non-fungible token. So, and then I'm working on a book, a novel called The Experiment, and I think I'll jinx it if I say too much, but the experiment in question is Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, where he got subjects to shock, electric shock, a person if they got answers incorrect. So it kind of references to that quite a bit.
Yeah. So I have just came out Tuesday, a novel called American Girl. It was first released as an Audible original, and it was #1 for them, so it did well, and so I decided to find a publisher and bring it to print. So it's out in print for the first time. It's the story of a 17-year-old autistic girl in a small town in Pennsylvania who gets caught in the crosshairs after her boss at a local sandwich shop is found murdered. And it's all in her voice. It's sort of a mystery, who killed Clay Cooper. It's a thriller because people are after Charlie when they find out she may have seen something about the murder. And it's also very much an emotionally charged small town drama because Charlie is trying to keep her friends and family safe throughout this 5-day period. And then in June, What Remains came out. I described that earlier. It's about a cold case detective who takes one life to save another, and setting off a dangerous cat and mouse game with the man whose life she saved. And then in 2024, I have an Audible audio play. It will be fully scripted with sound effects, and it's called Mad Love, and that will, that's going to hopefully be out in 2024. And I sort of pitch it as a Dirty John meets Tinder swindler meets me.
What a description. Lynne, how about you?
So, as I said, our most recent is The Senator's Wife, which came out in May, which is the story of a woman reeling from the loss of her husband, and she's remarried back in DC and dealing with lupus, and then she's dealing with this home health care worker who comes in. And we, my sister and I just finished our edits, or we're in the midst of finishing them for the sequel to The Last Mrs. Parrish, which is going to be called The Next Mrs. Parrish, and that comes out on June 4th. So we're very excited about that.
Amazing. Congratulations to
you?
all. Yeah, I think I mentioned the 5th book in the series, Devil's at the Door, comes out December 5th, and the first 4 in the series are all available now in paperback. So let's open it up to questions. Go ahead.
Hi. I really appreciate hearing your guys' perspective through this presentation. I wanted to ask, what types of relationships would you like to cover, or that you like to read or seek being covered, such as mother-in-law relationships, or with sisters, or with friends, that you see as not really covered in the crime genre?
Who'd like to tackle that one?
Wow. Anybody? Yeah.
Manju, go ahead.
Yeah, I grew up in fairly traditional Indian homes, but also non-traditional, because both my grandfathers were very keen on education for women, etc. But they were also very patriarchal. And so I really like exploring which I don't see often, the father-in-law, daughter-in-law relationship. And I feel like that's, it's a different dynamic altogether. And yeah, it's just very interesting for me to tap into my past to get information from there.
Yeah, I'll just add one maybe less common relationship, at least when it comes to crime fiction, is that I have explored the relationship between a woman and her aunt quite deeply in my series. The aunt has a lot of mental health issues that she struggles with, and the niece does to some extent as well. She's dealing with anxiety and PTSD, so that was a very interesting relationship to kind of unpack as well. Another question for us?
Hello, ladies. I want to just start out by saying I am from Greenwich originally. I no longer live there.
We won't hold that against you. Kidding.
And speaking of that, I know many of you up there do write about places in which you've either grown up or are very familiar with, Tessa specifically. How does that, how are you able to write something like that without having some sort of bias? And for me, personally, I don't think I can read your book about Greenwich because I live there and I kind of know the people's attitudes and the stereotypes. How can you sell me a story which I may already have some sort of bias towards?
So, yeah.
Great question. Elise,
Can I
you
take
probably
that?
should start.
One of the reviews I had on my Amazon First Reads was from a woman from Greenwich. And I really appreciated it because she said that she was a little nervous about reading it and that she felt like I really hit the nuances of Greenwich. And I've had readers from people who are in the mansions on North Street to, you know, my main character lives on one of those side roads in one of the Victorian old historic society homes. And it's not a comment on Greenwich at all. It's just a setting. I mean, it's mostly about the sports world. It's mostly about her interactions. So it could be any town. And I was warned, like, don't write about a real town, it's gonna get you into trouble, but I was warned after the book went to print. I would be very interested in you reading it and then emailing me or calling me and letting me know, because I really tried hard, because there's so many cool little nooks in Greenwich that like little pizza stores no one knows about, or a diner, or, you know, the block where they go trick-or-treating, and I have so many friends from the area, so it's definitely not a negative portrayal. Yeah, so I'd be interested to hear what you think. So now you have to read it.
Right. And I want to comment on that in terms of setting, because in The Last Mrs. Parrish, we did use Bishop's Harbor. We didn't name a Connecticut town for that very reason, because in that book, there are some unflattering sort of portraits of, you know, some of the people in the town. But then when we wrote The Wife Stalker, that takes place in Westport, that wasn't, I mean, it's beautiful, you know, it's all about the charm of Westport. It has nothing to do with that. So I think it depends really right on the sort of way you're spinning it.
Yeah, and I never name my towns because, well, for that reason, but also I don't want to be bogged down in accuracy of streets, and also, you know, I want to be free to say, okay, well, maybe it's a little bit like Greenwich, but maybe it's also super religious as well, or it's, you know, whatever it is. And so I always picture a town or conflate a few towns in my imagination. But for me, what's most important is leaning into those experiences, because when you live in a place and you really absorb the culture and the pressures that are, you know, put on people from that particular culture, that is where you get so much rich material for these, for characters to do things, feel things, and behave in a certain way that they might not in another environment. And you can also create atmosphere from that if you know a place very well, that you have felt it, and then in describing it, you're able to really bring that to the reader. So I think there can be a lot of benefits to writing about a place that you know very well.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. And there's a lot of value to being a local and having that deep understanding of a community. Yes. And it's very tempting to put that on the page because that's not something we need to research. That's something that we inherently understand, right? And there is so much research involved in these types of novels anyway. So if you can just draw on some experience that's easily accessible, it's hard to resist in a way, right? Thank you for that question. Do we have another one?
Last one, quick question. My question was triggered by a conversation I had with my daughter. We're on the Metro North train, and she and I start talking, and we said, okay, who would you have to take out first, if you had to, push come to shove kind of thing. And here she's a soccer player, ponytail, very genteel-ish kind of. So she worked into my first novel in that kind of role, and I might work her into the next novel. And I kind of like that, no offense to librarian, but, librarian who's also a martial arts, person. Do you think I'm barking up the right tree with that kind of complexity? So that's my question.
Oh, I have my protagonist is a martial artist too, so I would say you are definitely on the right track. I think it can work very well, right, to have a multifaceted character with some, maybe, in your case, maybe some unexpected skills that someone who just glancing at them wouldn't imagine that they would possess. What is it? Does anyone else have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about AI now among writers, and can books be sort of just churned out by artificial intelligence, and what is it that writers are going to bring to the table that can't be manufactured? And I think everything that we know well, and that can something unique like that. This is where writers really add value. It's not just in our sentences, it's not just in our plots, but it is in our unique experiences as we've walked through many years of life, experiencing our children and their hobbies and our own, and something like that, combined with everything else that you would probably put into your book, is something that's going to be truly unique. And and that is, I think, where human writers shine, is by bringing those things into our work.
Thank you all, ladies, for your time and your expertise and your really gripping books. And thank you all for coming out to StoryFest today. We have copies of all of their books in the Kamansky room for sale, along with signed Neil Gaiman books. We still have a few of those. And these lovely ladies will be signing your books right along here afterward. And please stay tuned for the next panel.